Hello and good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. My name is Sara Nasseri. I'm an attorney, labor and employment attorney at PilieroMazza. I just want to thank you all for joining. Obviously, there is quite a bit going on with the OFCCP and the new Affirmative Action Program compliance portal or contractor portal. So today we're going to spend, a good hour just talking about what the portal is and how government contractors can start preparing for this new compliance certification. Just a little bit about myself. Again, I'm a labor and employment attorney at PilieroMazza. We counsel employers on a range of workplace-related matters, focusing on legal and regulatory compliance, such as OFCCP compliance. We do pretty much a wide range of different practices and cover, a number of issues, and, the whole list is there. But again, we do labor employment specific for government contractors and, of course, non-government contractors as well. And a little bit about the firm. I don't necessarily want to go into too much detail here because everything's on the screen, but PilieroMazza is a full-service business law firm. Again, we work as strategic partners, to both government contractors and commercial businesses, and obviously have a pretty wide scope of different practice areas that we serve our clients with, and the whole list is there. So if you have any questions, or if you see anything on there that triggers any interest beyond just, of course, labor and employment, then obviously feel free to email us or subscribe to our mailing list below. All right, so let's dive right in. It looks like folks attending are slowly ticking up a little bit here, but I think we have the majority of everyone, so we'll just go ahead and get started. First things first, I assume many of you know, but just in case you don't, what is the OFCCP? Who are they? What do they do? We're going to just sort of start a little bit with some of that background, kind of set the framework of what the agency is, what it does, and then obviously dive into what this new certification requirement entails and what it means for government contractors. So first things first, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, better known as OFCCP. They are a subdivision of the U.S. Department of Labor. Their main mission and responsibility is that employers who do business with the federal government are required to comply with the laws and regulations requiring non-discrimination. So this is sort of parallel to the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that sort of has that same goal and agenda and mission for private sector employers. The OFCCP is kind of taking that same idea and concept and bringing it in within the realm of federal contracting and specific to federal contractors. So, if you are a federal contractor or subcontractor, it's, safe to bet that you've heard of the OFCCP. You may not have come across them yet, fortunately, but even if you have not, the more likely than not, if you are doing business with the federal government, then you are at least, cognizant of the OFCCP and certainly of their rules and regulations. And so the mission statement of the OFCCP, I think it's worth sort of reiterating here. Again, their goals are to protect workers, to promote diversity, and of course enforce the law by which they have jurisdiction over. They essentially are holding those employers who do business with the federal government responsible for complying with the legal requirement to take affirmative action and not discriminate on the basis of a series of protected classes, including race, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, national origin, disability, and/or status as a protected veteran. So contractors and subcontractors alike are prohibited from taking any adverse action, including discharging or otherwise discriminating against both applicants and employees, you know, on the basis of those protected categories, as well as taking any discriminatory action against applicants or employees who inquire about, disclose, or discuss their compensation or that of others. So again, you know, this isn't anything new or groundbreaking. This has been the mission of the OFCCP for years. Those protected classes have remained the same over the years. And again, it sort of runs parallel to what we see other agencies such as the EOC doing. But of course, this is very much specific to federal contractors and subcontractors. And you know, if you are a federal contractor or subcontractor, then the enforcement agency or the authoritative body that is responsible for enforcing these laws and making sure that you know, these obligations are met is going to be the OFCCP. So who is leading the OFCCP? Of course, as within, you know, any department or agency, you know, within the political branches, every couple of years, right, every administration change, every new president brings with it new leadership at the OFCCP and, of course, within the Department of Labor and other agencies as well. So under the Trump administration, we had Director Craig Lean. You know, he was very much just focused on, you know, not only, of course, the specific obligations that the OFCCP enforces, but also very much focused on individuals with disabilities, just for personal reasons and by way of his background. So I think it's important to also kind of take a moment and discuss who the new director of the OFCCP is under the Biden administration and sort of what her background is, because I think it is very much telling as to how the direction of the agency is expected to go and is already going, frankly, and what we can sort of expect to see given Director Yang's background. So again, once the Biden administration came into power last year, we got obviously a change of leadership at the OFCCP. So the new director is a woman by the name of Jenny Yang. She was formerly a plaintiff's attorney, so representing employees. And then she was, at some point later on in her career, appointed to the chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EOC, before then coming on to the OFCCP. So what does this mean? She obviously has tremendous experience with all these sort of non-discrimination, affirmative action obligations, albeit, you know, with the private sector under the EOC, but obviously she's well aware of sort of what that big picture mission, goal, obligations encompasses. And, you know, she brings with her a pretty tremendous experience, you know, from being both a plaintiff's attorney representing employees and also being the chair of the EOC. She's obviously bringing a decent amount and years of sort of practical and real life experience to the OFCCP. I think it's worth noting that during her time at the EOC, she's actually the one that spearheaded that requirement to disclose paid data on EEO1 reports. That's sort of been up in the air and in limbo right now, but she was the one that introduced that requirement, and she, you know, very much led the efforts to do so, right? So she, you know, I think it's safe to say that she has a very big focus and a big interest on pay equity and compensation discrimination. So, you know, we're expecting that compensation will play a big role in part of, you know, what she strives to do at the OFCCP and ensuring that you know, everyone is paid equally, regardless of, you know, race, gender, or any of the protected classes. Of course, there's going to be differences in pay depending on skills and job titles, but, you know, as long as those differences are not based in any discriminatory animus or based in any sort of, you know, discrimination, then, you know, generally that's going to be a big part of what the OFCCP's mission is this year. So, I would say for federal contractors, subcontractors, take note of this big sort of potential focus on pay equity and compensation discrimination. If it means kind of conducting internal proactive pay equity analyses, then we would certainly advise, employers to do that and take measures to ensure that they're conducting sort of these self audits and making sure that everything is good to go before the OFCCP comes knocking on your door. So just a little bit of background as to who Director Yang is and what to expect in the coming, couple of years. So the OFCCP administers and enforces 3 different equal employment opportunity or EEO laws, right? So these are the big 3 laws that federal contractors and subcontractors, hopefully you know of already, but if you don't, these are the 3 laws that the OFCCP has jurisdiction over and has the ability to enforce. So the first is Executive Order 11246. This essentially establishes requirements for non-discriminatory practices in hiring and employment specific to women and minorities, right? So whenever you hear EO 11246, it essentially means, ensuring that there is no discrimination taking place specific to women and or minorities. The next is Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, or better known as just Section 503. This essentially requires contractors to take affirmative action and prohibits contractors from discriminating, on individuals with disability when it comes to employment terms and conditions. So Section 503, again, is very specific to individuals with disabilities, and it only is applicable to contractors and subcontractors with contracts of more than $10,000. Now, that's a pretty low threshold to meet, and chances are, if you're a federal contractor or subcontractor, you more likely than not are going to meet that. So you are more likely than not going to have to oblige by the requirements of Section 503. The next is the Vietnam Era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act of 1974, better known as just VEVRAA. This was originally enacted years ago to protect returning veterans from the Vietnam War from discrimination and to ensure that they had access to the same equal employment opportunities and so forth. It now covers pretty much all veterans, and the definition of a protected veteran is pretty broad. So again, under VEVRAA, you have the responsibility, so long as you meet that threshold, and we'll talk about it shortly, to ensure that you're not discriminating and hiring enough veterans within your workforce. So these are the jurisdictional thresholds that we're talking about and that I want to make sure that everyone references. I don't know why on the right there, VEVRAA popped up a little bit bigger. There's no reason why it's been magnified, but we can certainly start there. So if you know, under VEVRAA, there is sort of, some slight differences under the other laws with regard to supply and service and construction contractors. For purposes of VEVRAA, there is no difference. So if you are a federal contractor or subcontractor of any kind, whether it's supply and service or construction, your basic coverage, right, those basic obligations to meet, the VEVRAA requirements will kick in at any number of employees and a contract of $150,000 or more. So long as you have even 5 employees, but you have a contract valued at that $150K or more, then you are obligated to meet just the base level requirements under VEVRAA. Now you'll note that the AAP coverage and this AAP coverage requirement kicks in for all 3 laws at 50 or more employees, right? So at 50 or more employees, you are obligated to create an AAP under VEVRAA if you hold that $150,000 or more contract, right? But if you go to the left there and you look at Section 503 and Executive Order 11246, that AAP coverage kicks in at $50,000 or more. So You know, obviously there are different AAPs under each of these laws. So, you know, many employers may only be obligated to develop a Executive Order 11246 AAP, or you know, just an Executive Order 11246 and a Section 503 AAP. But as you'll note, the VEVRAA contract value is, you know, substantially higher. So sometimes contractors don't need to create and develop a VEVRAA AAP, even if they have to develop and maintain AAPs under EO 11246, for example. So just important, you know, just to know sort of where things stand and where you as a federal contractor or subcontractor may stand and what you're obligated to do and create under each of these laws. So I would encourage everyone to, you know, keep these jurisdictional thresholds handy. These are available on the OFCCP's website. You can just click into it, save it as a PDF, just so you're sort of aware and have an understanding of what the basic thresholds are and at what point these different requirements kick in. So essentially what this all comes down to is, you know, 2 general rules, right? So in order to be compliant with your OFCCP and or EEO obligations as a federal contractors, you are required to, 1, not discriminate against applicants or employees based on any of the categories protected by the laws described previously. And again, I want to just underscore that this is not strictly specific to your employees. It also applies to those applicants that are applying for employment. So again, 1, you want to ensure that you're not discriminating against both applicants or employees, and 2, that you're taking affirmative action to ensure that there's equal employment opportunity without regard to, you know, any of those protected categories, and that you're advancing and actually employing individuals with disabilities and individuals who are protected veterans, right? So 2 general rules, you know, those are the 2 big picture, you know, rather big ticket items that you as a federal contractor need to oblige and are obligated to comply with. And again, the whole sort of basis of all 3 of the laws are to further these 2 general rules. Okay, so we're going to launch just a couple of polling questions here. And the first one here that I'm going to launch is, what is the deadline to implement an AAP once awarded a government contract? So if you can take a moment. The options are 30 days, 60 days, or 120 days. Okay, so we're going to close the poll here, and it looks like pretty even response for each of these. You know, it looks like everyone sort of had an equal bucket of answers here in each of these, but the actual answer is 120 days. So if you are a federal contractor or rather you've just been awarded a government contract and you are new to federal contracting, then you have 120 days from the date of award of that contract to develop your AAP. So you have some time. Okay, so really quickly, before I forget, I am keeping an eye out on questions, and I see that 1 or 2 have come through, so I'll also address these. I will do my best to answer questions as we go. You know, sometimes I may miss, you know, a few, or I may not be able to cover it in lieu of time. We will be receiving, you know, a sort of registration list and a list of questions at the end of the program. So if you do have any questions that I'm unable to answer, first off, I'm sorry, but second off, I will reach out individually to each person that asked a question that I may not have had the time to respond to, and I'll ensure that I do get a response for you. The next sort of thing that I forgot to mention is this program does and is eligible for HRCI credit. So in order to receive the HRCI program ID to get credit, You guys will have to endure remaining for the duration of this program. So I will provide the program ID towards the end of the hour. So just two sort of housekeeping items that I forgot to mention. And really quickly, let me just address one question here. It says contractors already certify us to AAP and SAM, like most representations and certifications. Why are we creating another portal or site to do the same thing and now in two different places? Great question. So you are absolutely correct in that contractors already sort of have this obligation to certify their AAP compliance in SAM, right? We don't really know at this point why, the OFCCP has now also created this separate sort of, obligation certification portal. What we imagine is that the OFCCP, again, is the authoritative body that is responsible for enforcing these laws. And so by creating their own portal, it provides them direct access or data to these certifications. And it could present, again, we actually just had a call with the OFCCP director last week, and we were trying to ask her and fish for some information as to sort of what they intend to do with this data. She didn't provide anything, which is not surprising. She just told us to look out for some FAQs in the next couple of weeks. But we assume that by having this portal themselves and by having these certifications come directly to the OFCCP, then it will provide them with firsthand real-time data as to, which contractors may or may not be certifying and may or may not be compliant with their OFCCP obligations. We don't know if that means that those contractors are more likely than not to face an audit, or if, you do certify that you're compliant, that you may sort of, remove yourself from a list of potential audits to come. We just don't necessarily have that answer yet, unfortunately. But again, we believe and assume that by creating this separate portal, the OFCCP sort of wants to have direct access to this data, and then certainly wants to have, their hands in sort of that information. So, we'll see if there's any more clarity that comes from the agency directly. With regard to developing and maintaining AAPs, again, we talked about federal contractors who are new, who have just received a government contract, have 120 days from the start of the contract to develop their AAP. And I'm sure many of you know, throughout your AAP year, you're going to be collecting certain information and conducting analyses for various required components of the AAP. And I'm sure many of you have seen that it sort of is a pretty in-depth and detailed, pretty much snapshot of what your workforce looks like statistically, and then also sort of what measures you're taking and what, goals and problem areas you're identifying for the next year. So the analyses is essentially intended to help you measure your progress toward equal employment opportunity. There's no sort of right or wrong answer to how you're doing. Some contractors and clients say, well, oh gosh, I'm finding all these indicators, and is that going to look bad? And the truth is, it's not. As long as you're identifying those issues and identifying the problems and setting clear goals and obligations as to what you're going to do to remedy those indicators, then that's really all the OFCCP is essentially looking for in the AAP. They want to see that you're taking action, that that you have these problems that you're acknowledging, and that you're taking steps and measures to fix. Obviously, if you have an AAP that looks completely perfect, that will likely signal to the OFCCP that something is kind of suspicious and fishy there, because again, no contractor is going to have a sort of perfect workforce and a perfect way of how they're ensuring that they're meeting their affirmative action and non-discriminatory obligations. So it's okay to have problems that you're identifying. And in fact, it's actually a good thing to identify those problems in your AAP, be transparent about it, and then also be very transparent about the goals that you're setting in order to remedy those problems. Okay, so some AAP basics, selecting a plan year. So essentially, this is at the client's discretion, and at the contractor's discretion rather. So usually we tend to find that a calendar year, so from January 1st to December 31st is probably the most, easiest and just administratively easier to process. But you can certainly choose your own year if you have no sort of bad or malintentioned reason to choose those dates or discriminatory reason to choose those dates. So, if it makes sense for you to start it from the end of quarter 1 through the end of quarter 1 of the next year, then you can certainly do that if that's just sort of how your administration and then how you're sort of hiring and all that stuff kind of looks and makes sense to you. But most contractors tend to do the calendar year, so you want to start off by selecting your plan year. The second thing is determining what type of AAP you're developing. So a lot of times it's usually just an establishment-based single site or location, right? So you have headquarters in Washington, D.C., so your AAP is based in Washington, D.C., and you have that single AAP. Now, if you have 50 or fewer at a site, you can certainly have a separate AAP if you think that sort of just makes more sense for your workforce and how, organizationally your workforce is set up. Or you can certainly include those set of employees within the AAP that covers the location of the personnel function with whom they report to. So what that means, so if you have the Washington, D.C. headquarters and you have that AAP that's based out of D.C., but you have a contracting site in, Las Vegas, Nevada that only has maybe 20 employees working there, you can certainly include those 20 employees in that DC AAP, assuming that those employees report to, the headquarters in DC, which more likely than not they will, right? So it's sort of up to the contractor. If it makes sense to have them separate, you can certainly have them separate, but a lot of times we see those set of employees sort of pulled in to that main employer, or rather the headquarter AAP, because it just makes sense because that's the location for who they report to. You can also do AAPs that are called functional based, and they're essentially based on distinct business units. This gets a little bit tricky, and it again just depends on how you are organizing your workforce and how sort of the different establishments and different units work together. This you would need to come to an agreement with the OFCCP that you are able to do what we call the FAB or functional based AAPs. So you can't just go ahead and create an AAP like that. You'll have to come to an agreement with the OFCCP before you can do that. But again, the most popular and sort of the most common way that we see AAPs developed are, again, that establishment-based or single site or location-based AAP. Quick questions here. If you don't have 50 employees, do we need to do anything regarding the certification under this new program? No. If you do not have the 50 employees, then you have no obligation. If you recall in those graphs and the thresholds that we talked about, you have no obligation to develop an AAP, and so you have no obligation to certify compliance. We do see this question come up a lot because contractors obviously are, getting notification emails and all these alerts about this portal that's opening up. But, the truth is, if you don't have the 50 employees or you don't meet the contract value, then you have no obligation to create an AAP, and you have no obligation then to certify compliance. So that is one less thing you have to worry about. Now, with regard to AAP components, again, a lot of contractors tend to do their AAPs in-house. A lot of contractors, we have, a number of clients who have reached out to us as, their lawyers to help with AAP developments. We personally don't put the AAP together. We work with third-party vendors that, we've built relationships with who are AAP experts, and they do the statistical analyses day in and day out. We obviously stay on board because there is an advantage to keeping an attorney-client privilege, especially with regard to the underlying support data. So all that data of compensation, everyone's direct rate, salary, everything of that sort that you're providing to these third-party vendors, let's say, to create your AAP. If we stay on board, then we can establish attorney-client privilege so that that data does not go into the hands of the OFCCP down the line, because it would be considered attorney work product, right? So all this to say, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about as far as AAP components and what the AAP entails and how the development process works is really sort of done specifically with these third-party vendors, or if you have, someone in-house that puts that together. And so they are, much more well-versed in especially how the statistical analyses portions come together and so forth. So really quickly though, you're going to have your non-statistical elements. So those are essentially what we call the narrative, right? So that's all that text that you see in AAPs. It talks about your good faith efforts that you've done in the past year, what action-oriented programs you're taking to ensure that you're doing effective outreach and recruitment and so forth. So that's essentially where a lot of that narrative comes in within the AAP. And then, of course, you have the statistical elements. So these are where you're going to conduct your statistical analyses to test for adverse impact. So whether any personnel activities that you're conducting are creating statistically significant results, right? Are they resulting in indicators and flags that there is some potential for, some adverse impact that is affecting how you're conducting your personal activities, right? There's going to be utilization analyses, so determining where underrepresentation exists. So is there an area or a specific job title or specific, whether it's women or minorities or individuals with disabilities that are being underrepresented within your workforce. So you're going to conduct a utilization analysis to determine that. You're also going to conduct statistical analyses with regard to your goals. So what are your placement goals, right? And that's going to depend on not only your utilization analyses, but also just the state of your workforce and what your workforce looks like. And then there's going to be some statistical analyses with regard to your compensation and pay equity analyses, and then also your applicant tracking and record keeping. Again, all of this should not scare you. If you're producing indicators, that should certainly not scare you. The importance and what you want to sort of take away from all that is how you are drafting that narrative portion with regard to what actions you're going to take to remedy any potential indicators. And then you're going to have all, these additional sort of components. So you're going to want to talk about, who you're designating the responsibility of ensuring, your affirmative action program. Sometimes clients designate sort of someone within HR who can be their, AAP coordinator or EO compliance officer, whatever title you want to give that person. But you certainly want to designate someone who is responsible for ensuring that those obligations have been met. You want to identify your problem areas. You want to list the action-oriented programs, and then you want to make sure that you're conducting internal audit and reporting, or at least noting that you are, right? Then you're going to talk about your qualitative analyses, so on the right there. So you're going to do an organization profile, job group analyses. So this is going to be essentially a tally of different employees and different job titles based on those EO categories that you're using in your EO1 reports, and then identifying the women and identifying minorities to determine how sort of your workforce looks like. And then, going down, you're going to have the identification of problem areas with regard to your personal activity selection, your compensation, and personnel procedures, among other things. So it's a lot. Developing an AAP is certainly not easy. Developing your first AAP is probably the most tedious process and the hardest one, because it involves a lot of data gathering, going back, and especially if you don't have a robust applicant tracking system, and that's something I'll talk about in a little bit, that can certainly help. It's going to be a lot of sort of time and resources spent on pulling all this data, and then obviously, finding, whether it's someone within the company or outside of the company, to put all of these analyses together. So certainly if you are new to federal contracting, and if this obligation is new to you, this is probably going to be, a harder process to start with. But as the years go on, and as you've developed, more and more AAPs, it should just be sort of a plug and play in numbers, and then updating the narrative as, so that it accurately reflects what you're actually doing as a contractor. So with regard to some of the VEVRAA data collection analyses, so this, again, if you recall, your VEVRAA AAP obligation kicks in not only at the 50 employees, but at that higher $150,000 or more contract value. So not everyone necessarily will have to create a VEVRAA AAP if they're subject to the EO 11246 and or the Section 503 AAPs, right? But if you are, then under VEVRAA, these are sort of the different things that you have to take note of. And I think it's important to see this because, some people may not realize that you do need to keep those records for at least 3 years, because there's an obligation to collect the data up to 3 years prior, right? So you want to have a head count of the current number of your protected veterans, the number of applicants who self-identified as protected veterans. And again, this goes back to your obligation to roll out those self-ID forms for VEVRAA in Section 503. And then, obviously I don't need to go through the whole list here, but, it's pretty extensive, and you'll see that it goes back to the 3-year period before your AAP date. So what this means is you want to make sure that for purposes of data collection that you are keeping your records as required under the law, so keeping them for at least the 3-year period that it's required for, and then also making sure that you have all of these data points sort of ready to go and easily accessible. Again, if you have an applicant tracking system, then this shouldn't be that hard to pull from. But if you don't, and it's, if you're a very small business and smaller contractor, and you don't have the sort of means to invest in an applicant tracking system yet, then you want to make sure that you have some organized fashion, or some point person who's responsible for gathering all this data and ensuring that everything is there, so that you can provide all of this analyses to the OFCCP. Looking at a question here really quickly, what if the workforce is remote? Great question, as we live in this sort of new world, and everyone has been teleworking or is continuing to telework. So for your remote workforce, again, it goes back to that, if you recall, if you have a site that's 50 or less employees, then you can put those employees under that AAP that is the single headquarter establishment AAP, right? So chances are, if your workforce is remote, they are still more likely than not still reporting to the central establishment. And for that, you can certainly pull all of those remote employees under that single AAP umbrella and just include them in that AAP. So you don't have to create a separate AAP, because chances are you have maybe a couple of remote workers in different states, so you can just certainly pull those employees who are working remotely and put them within the AAP that is that sort of central headquarters single establishment AAP that you have. So back to VEVRAA, again, there is sort of these benchmarks for hiring of protected veterans. Again, it's not meant to be a goal. It's just more sort of, a benchmark, something that you should strive for. and something that, you know, you can certainly establish in two different ways. So the OFCCP lays out two different methods for establishing a benchmark. The first is the national percentage of veterans in the civilian labor force, which is currently 5.6%. So you can certainly strive to hit that 5.6%. This number is updated annually, so you know it was a little bit lower last year. This year it went up a little bit to 5.6%, and it may go up a little bit next year. It may stay the same. Regardless, that can certainly be the benchmark that you strive for. Or you can develop your sort of an individualized hiring benchmark using 5 different factors, and I've put the link there for folks to use or click into if you have time later to go through the 5 factors if helpful. But more often than not, we see contractors just using that national percentage of 5.6%. You know, it tends to work relatively well, you know, no matter, you know, how your workforce looks like. And then there is the Section 503 data collection analysis. So again, this sort of mimics what we saw with VEVRAA. You know, obviously, again, it goes back to the 3-year period. You want to ensure that you have the number of applicants who have self-identified as individuals with disabilities. So again, a pretty extensive list, and you know, I don't need to sort of go through and reiterate these again because we just did for VEVRAA, but you want to make sure that you are collecting this data because you do need to provide this data within the AAP. And I see a quick side note here. If you have a main headquarters, but lots of employees working remotely from their homes in various states, can you just have one establishment-based AAP based on the headquarter? Yes. So I think we just talked about that with the previous question. You can certainly do that, and you can certainly pull those remote employees within that headquarter-based AAP. Your utilization goals for Section 503. So the contractors right now have a 7% utilization goal for the employment of individuals with disabilities. So if you have, and there's some caveats here, if you have a total workforce of 100 or fewer, then there's a company-wide goal of 7%, not a 7% per job group utilization goal. So, you know, obviously you want to just sort of take note of that. And then another important thing, and we've talked about this previously, is you want to ensure that you're inviting not only the applicants who are applying for employment opportunities, but also your current workforce and your current employees to self-identify as individuals with disabilities, not only at the time of hire, but also at least one time every 5 years thereafter. So, you know, you want to make sure that you sort of have that practice established and that you're conducting these self-IDs, you know, as often as possible. We see some contractors do it on a yearly basis. I mean, you don't necessarily have to do that, but you want to at least do it once every 5 years to ensure that you're getting sort of a correct and more accurate current representation of what your current workforce with regard to individuals with disabilities looks like. Okay, and now finally, we're going to talk about what this new AAP verification requirement entails. So on December 2nd of this past year, the OFCCP finally announced the opening of its AAP verification interface portal. And I say long anticipated because it actually was long anticipated. The OFCCP had talked about this for years. They had a landing page ready to go on their website that essentially said, you know, still under construction for years and years and years. And we were just sort of waiting for the formal announcement and for the formal opening of the portal, and it's finally here. So on December 2nd, we finally got that announcement. And basically what happened and sort of the timeline that contractors should know is that beginning on February 1st, so a couple weeks ago, contractors were able to begin registering for access to the portal. So, you know, whether it was a direct email from the OFCCP that you may have gotten with, you know, information of how to register, or whether it was just, you know, learning of it, you know, through alerts or news or whatever it was, every contractor who was subject to the AAP requirement had the opportunity beginning on February 1st to go ahead and register to access the portal. So you had to, or you will have to, if you haven't already, create a login.gov account using an email, secure password. You need to enter your employer identification number, your EO1 headquarter or company number, and then your establishment or unit number. If you don't know your EO1 identifiers, then you are required to enter your EIN, your legal business name, and the DUNS number and the codes there. So, you know, obviously, assuming then that you have registered, if you haven't, the portal is still open for you to go ahead and register and gain access. And that sort of registration period doesn't necessarily end. It's just open since February 1st. Now, the next deadline that comes into play is that June 30th, 2022 deadline. And what that deadline is your actual deadline to submit your certification. So you begin accessing the portal, or rather you begin registration to access the portal on February 1st. You can begin accessing and certifying compliance beginning on March 31st, and then you have until June 30th to actually submit your certification. So basically, if you haven't registered for the portal yet and you're subject to the AAP requirement, please do so ASAP, so you sort of get familiar with what your login information is, how to access the portal, and so forth. There's actually a couple good how-to videos on the OFCCP website, sort of, you know, directing and providing information with regard to how to actually access. So go ahead and do that. And then once you have your access and registration complete, then beginning on March 31st, you can then go ahead and begin certification. And you have until June 30th to do that. Okay, so let's launch this second polling question. And the question here is, what contractors are subject to the new AAP verification requirement? Is it supply and service contractors only, construction contractors only, or both supply and service and construction contractors? Okay, I'm gonna close the poll here. So the majority here actually said both supply and service and construction contractors, and the answer is actually only supply and service contractors right now. So if we go to the next slide, you know, essentially, oh, maybe we didn't put a slide in there, but this new portal requirement actually only applies to supply and service contractors. So this doesn't apply to construction contractors. Now, if you are a construction contractor that, you know, does have sort of a supply and service aspect or holds a supply and service contract, then you will be pulled in to that obligation by virtue of that supply and service contract. But if you are a strict construction contractor who does not have any supply and service contractors, then you are actually not required to use the portal or certify AAP compliance at this time. So again, just to reiterate, this is only applicable to supply and service contractors and not to construction contractors who are, again, strictly construction contractors. So to the extent that provides some relief to construction contractors out there, you know, then hopefully it does. But, you know, for the most part, you know, many of these supply and service contractors, or rather many of the construction contractors, may actually have supply and service contracts. And in that sense, they would actually then fall within the realm of the obligation here. So one other thing to note before I sort of go into this AAP checklist and sort of best practices is certifying AAP compliance. At this point, we have no indication that doing this certification will exempt contractors from OFCCP compliance evaluations, right? It's not going to be sort of a free pass, like, you know, hey, I did my AAP, I'm certifying compliance, you know, I'm good to go. I shouldn't have to see the OFCCP again. No. Unfortunately, that's not the case, as much as, that would be wonderful. Certifying AAP compliance will not exempt contractors from OFCC compliance evaluations. So, obviously, I think we're still sort of waiting on questions from the OFCCP as to, what the failure to certify will do. Will that increase the likelihood of being selected for compliance evaluation or not, and sort of what the ramifications of non-certification are? Unfortunately, we actually asked that question to Director Yang, a week ago, but didn't get a firm answer, and we were just told to watch for additional guidance down the line. So, I will say let's look for that, because we do anticipate the OFCCP coming with some FAQs and additional guidance, probably closer to that March 30th date. I don't know why they would wait until the very last moment there to issue additional guidance, but, unfortunately they are. But I would look probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks for additional guidance from the OFCCP with regard to what sort of the intent and what the ramifications are. That said, the obligation to create an AAP has always been there, and as a question pointed out earlier, I mean, you do have to certify in your SAM registration that you are AAP compliant, and nothing has changed. That obligation is not new. So the hope is that this is not anything new, or that it's going to be a big burden for many contractors who have already met their obligations and are compliant, but it's just going to be an additional sort of avenue for making sure that certification happens. So really quickly in these last few minutes here, I just want to go through sort of an AAP checklist, audits, and best practices. So you want to make sure you're appointing an AAP coordinator, drafting an EO policy, conducting EO audit, obtaining the necessary data, conducting a self-audit, and evaluating recruiting practices. This is a very sort of broad checklist, but these are sort of the main points that you want to hit in putting together your AAP. And preparing for a compliance evaluation, I don't necessarily want to go too in depth with this, but there are different ways and procedures by which the OFCCP does conduct evaluations. They can either do a compliance review, where they essentially do a comprehensive analysis and evaluation of all of your hiring and employment practices, your written APs, and so forth. Or if you go further down the line, they can do what's called just a focus review, which is essentially just a review specific to one or more components of your organization. So they may do, for example, a Section 503 review, which is just specific to your hiring and employment practices specific to individuals with disabilities. And in that case, they may only look at your Section 503 AAP. So these are just the different ways that the OFCCP may, conduct an audit or evaluation. And, there's different sort of things that we've looked at within these compliance evaluations. I mean, they're looking at everything, right? So we can't say that there's just one aspect of what they're looking at. They're going to look at every sort of area of focus, from, your outreach and recruitment efforts to any adverse impact in your selection and personnel activities to, any pay equity disparities. And, again, it's sort of the range of what the focus is with regard to compliance evaluations is vast. And so for that reason, having a very detailed and concise and accurate AAP is going to go a very long way down the line. And with regard to OFCCP audits, hopefully you haven't come across one, but if you have, then you know that every year the OFCCP publishes what's called a corporate scheduling announcement list for both supply and service and construction contractors. Sometimes those two lists, depending on the type of contractors, comes out at different times. And then once the CSAL list is issued on the OFCCP website, that provides contractors sort of a 45-day courtesy notification before the OFCCP then begins scheduling, or rather sending their official OMB approved scheduling letters. So You know, you always want to, and we do this with our clients, whenever those CSAL lists come out, we want to immediately go through and identify any clients or, you know, anyone that we know that may be subject to an audit, because that gives them some additional time to prepare before they then receive the actual OMB approved scheduling letter, which then, if we look on the next slide, will give you a certain amount of time to submit your AP. So let's do this polling question number 3 really quickly. So after receiving the OMB approved scheduling letter, how long do contractors have to submit their APs? 30, 60, or 90 days? Okay, it looks like a pretty even response rate here, but it is 30 days, so not a very long time, right? So as soon as you begin receiving that scheduling letter, you only have 30 days to submit your AP, which is why it's imperative that you go check the OFCCP website when those CSAL lists come out, because it gives you that additional time to work with in preparing everything and making sure your APs are good to go. Again, something, I guess the most important thing on this page is to just note that the OFCCP will grant a one-time 30-day extension for just the supporting data where APs are provided, you know, in a timely fashion. So you can certainly ask for a one-time extension, but it's very rare that they'll give you anything beyond that. And you just actually never know if a compliance officer will give you the first time 30-day extension. So you just want to be very wary of time and deadlines, you know, especially once you find out you're on that CSAL list. And some quick best practices, you know, again, all we've talked about here is just essentially making sure that your AP is good to go. Again, if you are a contractor and you have been a contractor for years and you've hit that 50 employees, you know, for a while, then you obviously are well aware of the AP requirements and sort of the planning and process it involves. But you want to make sure that you are planning and preparing in advance and preparing well. You know, you want to be familiar with your organization and its internal practices. And of course, you want to have a working familiarity with the OFCCP and the laws and regulations they govern. So hopefully we touched on a little bit of these earlier in this webinar, so you have some familiarity now, but you of course want to sort of be more prepared to know what's to come. And just a quick note on that second point about investing a little bit of money in a thorough AP preparation service or robust ATS. Again, I talked about this earlier. Having a ATS system goes a very long way, especially when it comes to pulling that data together. And then, of course, working with a law firm and then a third-party vendor to have that AP developed is also recommended, because A, you keep that attorney-client privilege, and then B, you just have vendors who are, you know, work on APs day in and day out, who can ensure that you have a solid gold star AP ready to go, you know, when the time comes. And of course, you know, this goes without saying, but organization is key. You're never going to come across an audit that's come at a good time. So you just want to make sure that everything is, you know, at a central place, you know where to access it, multiple people have access to it. And then as we talked about, you want to keep those records and APs for at least 3 years. And then we'd also just make sure that you're conducting internal audits on an annual basis. So whether it's creating a compliance checklist of what kinds of things the OFCCP will be auditing, or doing what we call a pay equity analyses, which you can certainly work with law firms to do as well. That will certainly help in sort of identifying any problem areas that you have before then confronting the OFCCP about those problem areas. And I'm just gonna, again, not have to go through this in depth, but there is a to-do list of everything you need to do to ensure that you're compliant with the OFCC obligations. Of course, one of those is having an AP, and now one of those requirements is to certify compliance of that AP if you meet those thresholds that we talked about. Great, so I know there are a number of questions that I missed here, and I apologize for that, but I do have a pretty long list here, and I will make sure that I get that from my team. But if you do have any additional questions, my information is there. Please do not hesitate to reach out via email and let me know if you have any questions. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.